Hello and welcome to Conscious TV. I'm Iain McNay and today our guest is Chris Hebard. Hi Chris.
Hi, how are you?
And Chris has a whole venture called Stillness Speaks, and that's how we first got in touch. And Stillness Speaks is a little bit like Conscious TV in one way. He does interviews with fascinating people, mainly on non-duality. But Chris in himself is a great character and has had an amazing adventure, and that's what we're going to focus on today. So Chris, you were telling me earlier that when you were a kid, you felt uncomfortable in your own skin.
Absolutely. At a very young age, I went off to what in the United States we call prep school. It's a private school, boarding school kind of thing. I think it actually comes from an English tradition. I think Eton would probably be an example over here. But I don't think I was emotionally ready for that experience. And so I sort of felt very uncomfortable, like everybody else knew the rules, but I didn't. I think that's sort of what was going on within me. And so there was sort of this anxiousness about interacting with everyone and everything that sort of followed me when I was a kid.
And you, when you're a bit older, you were telling me you got high quite a bit. You kind of, I guess this is an attempt to rise above the anxiousness.
I would say yes. That there was a period of time when I was doing a lot of drugs and alcohol. And that was about trying to find a way out. I think it was about escaping, if I looked at where it started. It had its upsides in some respects, but I think mostly it was about relief. And in a sense, this whole journey is about looking for happiness. But during that phase, yeah, a lot of drugs, a lot of alcohol, a lot of hedonism. Yeah.
And your mother was actually very interested in Krishnamurti and Gurdjieff and teachers like that, but it didn't seem to impact you at the time.
One of the great discoveries for me is that most of what I consider to be original ideas and the direction spiritually that I'm going and some of the things are actually they're not really original. Most of my ideas and values belong to my parents from when I was very, very young. Yeah, my mother was a fine artist, and she was also into Gurdjieff. She was also into Krishnamurti. She was not a Christian. We were raised Unitarian. But she would take the time with us to talk about Christ as a great leader. So it was almost a Gnostic teaching on the spiritual sense and the sense of values that Christ had, as opposed to the reality of the Bible in a literal sense. So all that stuff was there, and yeah, I don't think much of it was taking at the time, or at least I wasn't aware of it taking at the time. But my whole life is dotted with that. When I was in prep school, I had through a series of events, I focused in languages. I started in Latin. That's a whole nother story. But at a point, they wanted me to go into Sanskrit. And I said, learn another dead language? I'm not interested. My prep school counselor encouraged me to enter a very private group that was studying two documents, one the Upanishads and the other Brahma Sutras. And I said, what do I want to read dead documents from 2,000 years ago? When I was in college, I ran a speakers bureau and a music thing. I used to hang out with Alan Watts. But it was more about drinking than it was about, Zen. But it was always there, sort of that subterranean thing. So I really don't know much about the idea of where the original ideas come from. But all those seeds were there. I just wasn't noticing them.
The seeds were being set.
Yeah.
But somehow at the time you didn't realize the significance of that.
Right.
But life was somehow beginning to follow its path with you.
Yeah, I don't believe in coincidence anymore, and I'm amused when I look back And I go, oh my goodness, look what was here, look what was there. And it's usually when I'm having a conversation with someone like you that I start going, oh my goodness, this idea that I thought was so original and so unique to me really didn't come from here at all.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well, maybe we'll get more into that later, but
Yeah,
that's
yeah.
where ideas do come from, because
Yeah.
that in itself is quite a fascinating and revealing subject. So I know
It
that
is a great subject.
in your 20s, you were into partying, into women, into having a great life. And yet at the same time you realized that something was lacking.
My, early on in school, it was about, I became very rebellious from an authority point of view. I became sort of very hedonistic. It was during the time in the 60s and 70s where being anti-authoritarian was very cool. So that played into the mix as well because the girls like that. Lots of drugs, lots of alcohol, lots of partying. There was a point when I thought that what I did best was throw parties, and that's how I got into music promotion. We can talk about that later. I love that part of your story as well. So yeah, that went on. But in a sense, that sense of lack then extended into my career, and then trying to fill it with other things, with material things, the fruits of my labor, different kinds of material objects, houses, cars, boats, places.
How aware were you at the time of that sense of lack?
I was aware, as I said to you, as we started this whole thing, about this sort of, at my core, this sort of profound sense of not being. I think I was very aware that at my very core, something was unhappy. But I had no concept of what that was about or where it was coming from. I just sort of felt that maybe I was different. Now, maybe everybody feels this way. I don't know. I can only speak from my own experience. But in some way that I was different, and that everybody else was having a good time, and I sort of had to pretend to have a good time, or that if I had a bigger something or a better something or more of something, that somehow that would make me happy. And I went through that period for a long, long time, okay? All the way up until 2006, however old I was at that point, in my 50s, right? So it wasn't like, we were talking last night, how 25 years ago you and Renata met at a consciousness retreat. I had no interest in any of that. So there was no focus on that. That whole shift happened so suddenly. And that's why I sort of sit here. Everybody looks at me and goes, well, what were you doing back then? I was completely extroverted, completely into business and pleasure. And
You see, if I can bring myself into this to some extent, that when I was in my 20s, I was certainly aware of lack, and I thought by getting something else, more money, better relationship, enjoying business more, whatever, I thought that would fill the lack, and there was an awareness of that. I was conscious that I was trying to get more, but of course I wasn't aware that the answers were never going to be satisfied on the outside, that something had to happen inside. And then I got into, discovered meditation and started a whole journey, slow journey in a way, but it was a journey inside. And I think so many people, the drive, it's tremendous drive, often tremendous creative drive on the outside. And yet, of course, as we've learned later in life, it's actually to satisfy something that's lacking on the inside that can never be fulfilled by the outside. But we almost have to do it to find out.
Right. The only question is when you discover that, when you become consciously aware of that. And I think for you, you became consciously aware of that process much earlier on. For me, I was so caught up, I would never put the word lack onto it or whatever it was. It was just a sense of dis-ease. Dis-ease. And it represented itself by saying, I just need to get this house. And then I get the house, and the second I get the house, not the second, but shortly thereafter, well, I need a better house. You know, so this was contagious, and it wasn't until very, very far down the road, and I'd been repeating this behavior on all sorts of different kinds of products in different areas of my life, that all of a sudden I just realized none of it's working. And I had a huge reversal in my life where everything that had been going my way suddenly went against me.
But things went your way for a long time, didn't they?
For a very long time, almost 20 years, almost everything.
Yeah.
Once I got sober in 1980. That's when I stopped the drugs and the alcohol and everything. It's interesting, though. That was an opportunity to open a spiritual gateway right there.
Because you had a friend, I think, that went into rehab, and that kind of quite shocked you.
Yeah. I had a lot of friends who didn't get to rehab, who shortly after I got sober died. I got sober in 1980, and the AIDS thing started right afterwards, and a lot of very dear people to me died. And then even in sobriety, you know, if you're working with people in recovery and alcoholism and addiction, one of the sad things is a lot of them don't get it. But there was this, you know, this huge void. So when that, trying to fill that sense of lack through drugs and alcohol to complete myself that way was open, there was an openness to see, to look this way. But I didn't do that. This is what I wanted to try to explain, what maybe the big difference is between you and I. At that point, I wasn't ready to do that. All that energy turned then around into business. And I treated business the same way I treated drugs and alcohol, the same level of obsession and drive and extroversion and all that kind of stuff. And in my mind, I guess I felt I had an advantage over anybody else that was drinking or doing drugs. That I could get ahead while they're partying. I can gain market share. I mean, I'm sorry, but it was really, and so there was really no introverted reflection. And this is one of the reasons why I'm always fascinated when I meet people who've been on this path for a long time. There was really no orientation towards that. Yeah, I knew who Maharishi Yogi was and that kind of stuff, you know, superficially. And I could smell some of that, and I had some friends who went to India and pursued that path. It took a 2x4 before.
So you had a series of events. So I think it started around around the year 2000, 2001.
Maybe, yeah.
Your wife left.
There was a whole series of events. I mean, there was, as well as everything had gone for me up until that point, everything went against me. That's when I was diagnosed with my illness. That is when my wife left with my 1-year-old child. That's when I got into litigation with the U.S. government and a multi-million-dollar 7-year lawsuit. That's when I disbanded my business. My mother and my father died within 90 days of each other. 3 of my 4 pets died. It was just absolutely mind-numbing. I had some surgical things that happened. I had IRS audits. I mean, just everything you could possibly imagine that hadn't happened, all happened at one time. And it didn't stop happening. It just kept, it had a momentum and a life of its own.
It's almost as if life was just really hammering you to give you a message, wasn't it?
That's the way I look at it. You know, I've met an awful lot of people who come into this very gracefully. They come into this because they have a deep interest, and there's an interest that's always been with them since they were very young, and they just sort of flow into this thing. For me, it was very abrupt. I had to be hit over the head with a 2x4, and so my experience is more a dark night of the soul, a very sudden collapse, a collapse of my entire belief structure.
Yeah, but I think a lot of people do come into it your way, but they don't always see the way through, the way forward, if you like. They just go down with it. And I think a lot of people that start to get interested in spiritual matters early is when they have a genuine experience that opens something,
Right.
and then the inquiry starts. They want to know more about it, and that didn't necessarily happen to you.
Well, let's just put it this way. You talk about going down, yeah. I don't think it was possible for me to go down any further. It just got to the point where I couldn't take one more breath. And I had a complete collapse. And there was a moment in time I was in my study in my home in Dallas, and I just broke down. It was in the middle of the night. I was in the fetal position, sitting on the floor, crying hysterically, praying to a God I didn't believe in. Please help me. And at that point, there was a surrender. And at that point, there was an opening. That's very difficult for me to talk about, but there was something extraordinary that happened in that moment. And that it was such a precipitous event, and a few other things that happened shortly thereafter, that it completely left me not knowing who I was anymore at all. And to be an entrepreneur, you have to be very self-assured. You have to be confident. The reason that you can do that is because I know quickly what needs to be done here, 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 and you're going forward. And I didn't know anything coming out of this.
So let's look at that more deeply. So what does not knowing who you are, what does that actually mean? What did that mean to you at that time?
As I said, I was into this, it might have been cathartic. I'm not going to try to characterize this other than just to say this is what happened. This breakdown and release and letting go, followed by being in a limitless, objectless, spaceless space. I don't know how else to describe it than that. Just pure openness. And in that space, occasionally a thought would arise. Just a thought would be there, and then it would go away. Space, emptiness, peace. No boundaries, no borders. And then another one, and then it went away. And then suddenly I had this very simple epiphany, which is these thoughts are Chris thoughts, or what I believe to be Chris thoughts. And if I'm sitting here watching these Chris thoughts, who or what am I? Completely, totally destroyed me. I had no idea what I was doing from that point forward. It absolutely stopped everything in my business, everything that I was doing, because I didn't know what to do. I didn't know where to turn, how to turn left or turn right.
So let's look at that again, because this is pivotal. So there was somebody, something watching Chris thoughts before you were Chris. You were your thoughts, your mind, you were the things that you do in life, your relationships, whatever. That was what you knew as Chris. And then you had the experience that there was somebody, something watching all that. So you couldn't actually be Chris.
Yeah, there was this openness. It's hard to explain, this spaceless space. And as I said, I'd been through this sort of emotional and breakdown, and releasing. There was still awareness. There was this sense of boundless freedom. But then this strange thing with these thoughts coming up and seeing them And realizing those were what I called Chris.
And this boundless space, as you call it, was the feeling there?
The feeling.
Was the feeling there?
I was not aware. This is hard to explain, because although I was sitting in the middle of the library, I was not aware of objective space. There was nothing objective about where I was sitting.
So there was basically confusion. You were...
No confusion.
Okay.
Complete serene peace and openness. In a sense, like I was home for the first time in a long, long, long time. So awareness, from that point of view, it's very hard to describe. And then thoughts arising out of this beautiful, open awareness, out of this spaceless space. I don't know how to put words to it. And okay. I hate to use it because, you know, I've been around this long enough to know how people, you could call it consciousness, you could call it this, or blah, blah, blah. But
anyway, that led you to retreat for about a year, didn't it? In an apartment, you just journaled?
Yeah.
You read?
Let me say first, not two retreats, but to retreat.
Yes.
Basically, fundamentally, I didn't know who I was anymore. I can't explain to you how disorienting that was to go through the first part of my life absolutely certain of who I was and what I was doing, and always going, okay, the next plane, the next business, the next this, the next girl, the next car, the next whatever it is, okay? Whatever that thing is. To, I don't know whether to turn left, whether to turn right, what's up, what's down. I don't know who I am anymore. I have no idea.
You went from a clear, established identity to that all being blown up, basically.
Yeah. And I think you were driving at this before. It wasn't some samadhi, would be a word, or nirvana, like joyous experience. It was very disorienting. It was very disorienting because my mind, I have a very active mind. My mind didn't have any way to explain what had happened. And I'd never even heard of any of this stuff. And so it wasn't clear to me what was going on. I thought I might be psychiatrically hospitalized.
Yeah.
And so I did. I spent almost a year's worth of time. I moved into an apartment. I saw almost no one. I saw my son sometimes. I journaled a lot. I just sat with myself in presence, just sat and meditated, or whatever you want to call it, but just sat with myself a lot, and then I wrote. And then I started doing some reading. On the internet, I started looking around on the internet, and that's when, during that period of time, I finally connected with someone else who seemed to have a similar type of experience, and that was Eckhart Tolle.
I think there was a night when you couldn't sleep.
Right.
And actually you'd previously dismissed Eckhart Tolle as something you didn't rate at all. And you picked the book up and you saw it differently.
It really, it's such a beautiful analogy for the arrogance of who Chris was. The closest that I'd ever come to spirituality was, there was an infomercial called the Psychic Friends Network, which is one of these 900 number things where you get to call into psychics. And it was a big deal in the United States, and I did some of those on television. So I had no spiritual inclination at all. I was sort of almost spiritually bankrupt. And someone had brought into my house during my career this book, The Power of Now. And I took a look at it, and I had this allergic reaction to anything that felt New Age or Sedona-like, or New Age crystals, or pet psychics. I just looked at it, I was just like, and I took it, I threw it across the room. I said, who brought this piece of crap into the house? And I kept throwing it away, and it kept showing back up. And then after this whole experience, I was walking through my house in the middle of the night. I couldn't sleep. And there's that book again. And I was so frustrated. I just saw it. I just said, you know, I'm just going to read this thing. I'm going to Evelyn Wood speed read it. Okay? I'll be through it in 30, 45 minutes, and I can get rid of it. So that's how I approached it.
And what was it that you picked up from the book? Do you remember?
You know, as soon as I started reading that book, and I'm not saying anything about any teachers or anything, I can only talk about this experience here, but I started reading it and I started having these aha moments as I was reading it. It was like, oh my God. And so I'd read 15 pages and I'd go, well, I'm going to read this in an hour, and then I go, oh no, this is going to take me an hour, this is going to take me a week, and then I'd read some more, and this may take me the rest of my life to really read this. Yeah. There were such huge openings. And then I got to this part where he was at Oxford University, and he'd had this experience where he had sort of a breakdown, and he saw his thoughts arising to him. And I read it, and I started shaking. I was like, there's someone else out there that's had a similar experience. Someone else maybe can explain to me. This is my first contact. I didn't even know what Advaita was. I had no idea what non-duality was. This is 2006. Yeah. No interested to know anything. And I just became obsessed. As soon as I read that, I said, I just have to talk to this guy. I have to find out more about this. And that was my first hope.
Yeah. And it's interesting because you read something where he had the same experience as you.
Yeah, like I don't know if it's the same, but we've talked, and we actually, on Eckhart Tolle TV, I had a conversation with him about this as well, because it's so deeply touched me. So he has this, there's a very, very special part of my heart for him.
Anyway, and then you got hold of a copy of a book called Eternity Now by Francis Lucille. It was a pre-release copy, and you read that.
So yeah, through some of Eckhart Tolle's associates, I was given a PDF preprint copy of a book called Eternity Now. And it wasn't like, I don't even know if non-duality press existed at this point. You know, some people say, oh, Chris, there was lots of stuff out there, you know. But for me, it was sort of amazing, you know. And I got my hands on this thing, and I started to read it. And I just went, this book is unbelievable. This book has got such depth and such discrimination and such intelligence. And it took quite a while for me to read it, and at the end of it, there was a phone number. A phone number on it. And I said, you know, you can't, you know, this has like been privately distributed, and it's a phone number to be able to get back. I can't call him, you know, this isn't a solicitation. Finally, I just said, oh, hell with it, I'm going to call it. And so I called it, and this sweet, totally awake guy who helps Francis by the name of Raj Thakore, he's in India, answered the phone. And he said, oh, I'm glad you like the book. And I said, oh, it's just an amazing book. And he said, well, why don't you come down? I said, well, maybe sometime in the future, you know, I'll be able to come see you. And he said, no, just come fly down. And he said, you know, in the afternoon we could sit around, you could ask some questions, and then we'll have dinner. And he said, then maybe afterwards we'll watch a movie and just hang out for a while. And I'm like, watch a movie? In my mind, okay, I wasn't aware of what was going on in my mind, but even in this, there was this huge hierarchy, okay? Teacher here, student there. So I couldn't imagine that I was being invited into, we're all going to hang out together, you know, kind of an environment. And I was in Vancouver and I lived in Dallas, and I just said, oh, the hell with it, I'm going. And I got in a plane and went.
The great thing about it is that you had the courage, or maybe it was desperation, I don't know, but you took the time to just be in an apartment on your own, and then when you got the chance of a breakthrough like that, you just followed it. And I guess that's part of what you also did in business. You had to act quickly, you had to make decisions, and so that part of you was developed to follow a lead. I need to go. So when you got there, what happened when you got to visit Francis Lucille?
I don't think, I just want to footnote that, but there seems to be a grace. I don't think I had a choice about any of this.
Okay.
When I came into this sort of dramatic thing, it was like I didn't know what I was doing, and my whole sense of orientation and priorities changed. I didn't know who I was, and I needed to know. And yeah, the intensity of drive that I had in business, we talked a little bit about this last night, may have shifted its focus because I lost all interest in business.
Yeah.
And all my focus went into what is going on here, who am I, what is going on. Everything was on the table. So, and a lot of the time, my next decision was based in this moment. I would just say to myself, okay, what are we doing now? Just wait.
So you got down to see Francis, and what did happen?
Everything. I'm blessed. And yeah, there were some remarkable experiential things. Like you were saying before, this process started through experience first and the mind not knowing. So I end up with, excuse me. I end up with a teacher who has the most dynamic intellectual skills of anyone that I've ever met. I mean, he's like amazingly intelligent guy who is also accessible in a way that I've interviewed lots of people, you've interviewed lots of people, very unusual, and was willing to walk with me through a lot of nonsense. And during that period of time, it is true that I had some absolutely unbelievable experiences, but it was, I mean, I don't know what you say to the guy who gave you the key to your prison cell, you know, eventually, but I mean, he spent a ridiculous amount of time with me. A ridiculous amount of time with me.
So it was like, it was one-to-one time with you?
One of the most unbelievable things about Francis's teaching and about Francis, and I can't say, and I want to be clear that I can't say what's going to happen from this moment forward, he's getting to be quite popular, is that it's not about going to a retreat for a week or a weekend, or whatever it is, and then going home and doing that. You can do that. But he is very open. He feels very strongly that being in the presence of the teaching is very important. I know what he's talking about the transmission of silence, the perfume of silence. That's the name of one of his books. So he encourages that, but he also makes himself accessible in a way that's very impersonal. He has a fairly big home. He lives in a very small piece of it. His private space is maybe 900 square feet out of maybe 4,000 or 5,000 square foot home. The rest of the home is open most of the time to people who come.
You see, the words that you used to me when we were talking one time was, it was like he was walking alongside you.
Yeah, part of what you come to discover is that you're learning the teaching. It's not about the teacher or the student, but you do inherit something, at least here, which is he became a friend. Now, I don't want to give you the idea that this is a sort of a personal friendship, but there's it's impossible for me to talk about Francis without talking about my teacher, my friend. Same.
And that is quite an unusual relationship between a teacher and a student.
Maybe outside of the Sangha, and he certainly, you know, maybe I needed more more hand-holding, I don't know. Or maybe he enjoyed my company. But I don't want to give the impression that this was unique to me. This is something he did to people. But he didn't promote himself, he didn't advertise himself. It was very small groups that were coming to him at the time. And he was totally accessible. And I'm not talking about just teaching accessible. Play tennis with him, travel with him, go to movies with him, eat at his home, have breakfast with him, talk politics with him, watch movies with him.
At what point did you start to realize who you truly are?
Well, there are different, along the way. I would say that I self-deluded myself about that because there's an intellectual understanding that begins. But Francis's teaching has to do with, it was so perfectly suited for this body-mind. It was really designed to help my mind be, this mind be able to realize it wasn't invited to the party. Let it go through and ask its questions. I was a materialist. I believed in the independent reality of the world, okay? And that was sort of a fundamental concept. And so first my mind had to go through all this stuff, this scientific, intellectual sort of exercise, until I realized that there was really no basis to be able to say, there's no evidence at all that consciousness wasn't the primary element of everything.
So let's look at that more, that process with your mind. So was it like your mind was hitting a series of dead ends? How was your mind trying to work this out?
The mind is a function of personality when it gets identified. And I was raised in schools with a very scientific tradition and a belief that after I die, the world's still here, and that there's an independent reality to it all. And that is a very subterranean belief system. It's a very subterranean belief system. And so until the mind actually realizes, is open to the fact that there might be another way of looking at things, until it's really ready to surrender that position, what is already here can't be seen. At some point, that resistance that the mind is constantly doing, trying to maintain itself as an identity, relaxes and can let go. And at that point, the magic can begin. But that magic happened long before my mind was ready. So we were talking last night about the difference between awakening and self-realization. There's a huge, I mean, you can have these glimpses or awakenings, and yet there's this process. And he walked with me through that process.
So tell me more about the process.
I don't want to try to mechanize what's going on.
No,
and
but
I don't
for
want
you, for you.
Yeah, I want to be very clear that A, I'm not a teacher. There are great teachers out there.
No, I want to hear about your process.
Yes, but I'm going to go through. But first, let me footnote, because people will hear this, and I don't want to give the implication that it's anything but my own personal experience. There is an orientation within Francis's teaching towards a particular, one of the orientations that he uses are the teachings of a not as well-known Indian teacher by the name of Atmananda Krishna Menon. And it's an investigation of truth through an investigation of sensing, thinking, and feeling. What are the realities of what we're experiencing right now? So it's an investigation which goes through all perception.
So sensing, describe what you mean.
Sensory perception. What am I actually seeing as opposed to what my imagination is telling me I'm seeing? What am I actually hearing? What am I actually tasting? What am I actually feeling? Okay, all the sensory perceptions, plus all the thoughts that are going through my mind. What is it arising to? Are they my ideas? Are they not my ideas? All this process, even what we would call feelings. Francis doesn't like that word. Well, I'm going to characterize it that way. These are bodily sensations with a sense of me attached to them.
So you were looking really at everything that was happening to you, whether how you saw something, how you heard something, you were looking at your thoughts,
Yeah.
you were looking at your emotions as they came up, your feelings.
Right.
You were looking, and what was the process when you looked?
Well, there was this, I think a lot of people have done this. This is Driksha and Advaita. But there is, for here, there was a tremendous amount of entanglement with objects. Now, those objects could be subtle or gross. They could be the belief that I am the body, the belief that I am the mind, or some set of beliefs, or that I'm a sensation, or that I start here or I stop there. All these things that I assumed were true.
So it was to do with identification.
I think it ends with identification, yeah. Who's looking at what, and what's going on. Now, track back to this experience I had of this great emptiness, this spaceless space,
Yes.
okay?
Yes.
Okay, so with no idea there, I can now come back to a teacher who starts saying, well, let's watch what's going on, not only in the mind with thoughts that are coming and going, what was here before the thought? What was here during the thought? What was here after the thought? For things to change, there has to be a changeless element.
There has to be a
Changeless element. And that would be what reality is, right? The part of it that's not changing. Thus, the statement, that which is never ceases to be. That which is not, which is everything that's perceived, never existed. Never comes into being.
I've also heard it talked about as the never changing and the ever changing.
Right.
And this never changing, it seems, became more and more apparent that was your true identity. Is that correct?
Yeah, and there's another statement that from here became true, because it's almost like identity becomes a cataract over the eye from here. That the moment that some of that holding on to various beliefs and sensations, whatever it is, it became very obvious that truth without love is not truth at all. That the substance, the very substance of everything is love and beauty. That one of the reasons, again, coming back to Francis, he wrote a book called Truth, Love, and Beauty. And they're the different faces. Truth being through the mind, love being through the heart, beauty being through the senses. The three major perceptive channels.
And how long was this journey taking? This was becoming your primary focus, really?
It really has been almost as much as I could afford to, my exclusive focus. It's my exclusive interest. In fact, I became sort of a one-trick pony for a long time. The only thing that really interested me was this burning desire. You can call it grace. This is the only magic in the whole deal, is where does that sense of interest come from? But for me, it was an overwhelming interest. There was nothing that's ever been written in any tradition about this that I wasn't interested in.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think there's a lot of people who think that something happens and you have a spiritual opening and your whole life changes and that's it. But your experience is that actually you made it a primary focus year after year, and you still are.
Let me share with you how it's been here.
Yes.
Very clear awakening and seeing of what I am. Followed by, that doesn't mean that you could have this unbelievable experience, but all experiences comes and goes. And what is left, apparently, there's a lot of conditioning. So there's all this momentum, this Chris momentum for 55 years, this how he does business with people, how he does business with humans, how he treats his body, the kinds of foods he eats, the kinds of thoughts that pass through this space, all that stuff. So there's first maybe an awakening or a glimpse or whatever it is, but it's consciousness without an object. And then there is a period of time, relatively, of self-realization, what I call the self-realization process, where stuff from time to time comes up. It's all new, it's all fresh, there's no telling what's going on. I cannot say to you that it ever ends, because it's not my experience that it ever ends. It may in fact end, and you become just pure, okay? But that's not my experience. My experience is there's no telling what's coming next. The difference is that life has gone from, as we were saying before, a pursuit of more, trying to complete myself through objects, trying to make myself whole from that sense of lack, from that, to feeling whole and being able to celebrate wherever I am, whenever I am.
So your mantra changed from more to celebration.
Yeah. And now I had to learn that.
Yeah.
There is, understand from the escapism that I come from, okay, the whole drugs and alcohol thing and all that stuff, it's easy for me to see now that Advaita and the emptiness could be the ultimate escape, could it not? If you're really frightened. And at my core, there was tremendous fear. Fear of life, it's not safe, need for approval. What you think of me is really, really important, and it shaped most of my behavior. I didn't know this, okay? But this is who Chris really was. He was a great actor. Okay? So to go from that and then to expect it, because all of a sudden you see that the silliness of that whole thing, that there isn't forward momentum. It's sort of like you're driving a car at 150 miles an hour and you put the clutch in and the clutch is still spinning. Now, is that going to spin for 6 minutes or 6 years? Who knows? But it's not an unenjoyable process. It's a process of not knowing. And just being available for what's arising right now is just the most unbelievable experience. And that's what it's like for me. I can't say how it is for someone else, and I don't mean to imply that it should be this way for anyone else, okay? Stillness Speaks is really about a resource to get people so they can discover for themselves. It's mantra.
So you started Stillness Speaks about 3 years ago, I think?
Well, actually, it started in 2007.
Okay.
And in a very haphazard way. And the reason was in my discontentment and everything, as I found something that I thought was that had value, I saved it through this little teeny website I had called Stillness Speaks. At that time, from this perspective, I didn't see a lot of Advaita websites. You see tons of stuff now. But at that particular time, and I've talked to people and go, that's ridiculous. There's plenty of stuff. I mean, Wayne Lickerman had a thing, Adya had a thing, probably Gangaji had a thing, Dennis Waite, Advaita, you know, they may have been out there, but it was not, you were just as likely to run into pet psychics as you were Indians, okay? And so it was very frustrating for me when I found something that I thought really clicked here.
Yes.
I decided I wanted to hold on to it and just leave it someplace in case someone like me came along. So it's only ever been about my own journey. It was about, okay, this is
these
valuable
interviews are like markers of your own path.
Even before the interviews, it was like, I read this text, or I read this quote, or I had this or that. And then as that started going on, I then started getting the opportunity to do some film. And in my business, which is direct response advertising, we do infomercials and TV. And so it wasn't a huge transition for me to do that. Just how to do it economically, as you and I've talked about. And then that became part of my journey. If I found you interesting, what a wonderful thing.
So you'd
And
invite
you
someone
tell me,
for
I
an
get to
interview.
sit with Iain, we get to have this wonderful conversation, I get to spend some time with him, I get to have dinner with him. I end up with these friends, you know, and meet some remarkable people. So,
One thing you were talking about yesterday to me was that you feel that communication for you is changing, and it can be through music, it can be through the space between the words. It isn't just about the words. Do you want to talk more about that?
well, I was fishing with you on this because you do interviews as well. And I was a very bad interviewer, and I may still be a bad interviewer, but I'm learning a bit about it. But I'm also finding that there are limits to what the mind can say about this subject. And that, in fact, it's really an exercise to get the mind to quiet down and to finally surrender. That's all it was about. Having a big mind is no advantage in this, but if you have a big mind, it'll help you dismantle very quickly all the boundaries it put up. And now I find that redundant. It's hard for me to sit with someone and just go through the same material over and over and over again. But my motivation is I'm really happy about being a servant to the servants of God. That's a Tabriz quote. Just to be able to get this material out there, because I know that some people will hear it from one person and they won't hear it from another, or this approach will work and that approach. I don't really care. If I feel value there, I'm just honored to be in the process. It's a beautiful process.
What are you thinking as you sit there?
I'm blessed.
You're blessed.
I'm surrounded by angels.
Yeah.
The great gift for me, it's an unbelievable gift, has been the upgrade in the people who I call my friends. They're the most remarkable friends. Some of them are teachers. Some of them are very anonymous. They come through emails like they do to you. And they're fully awake people. They're just beautiful, gentle, humble people. They just don't care to teach. And it's just remarkably wonderful. And beyond food, clothing, and shelter, the basic needs, one of the things that I've discovered is that being in the company of like-minded people is my greatest joy. It's almost as if I don't want to make this sound like a slogan. The consciousness enjoys the company of itself, recognizes and enjoys the company of itself.
Mm.
And so when I have a sincere heart conversation like we're having, it just opens me up. It just opens me up. It's such a pleasure. It's such a pleasure. And so for me, the great gift has not been about commerce. This is a disaster financially. But I'm honored and I'm thrilled, and it's not lost on me that I'm surrounded by people, just really magnificent people. From my wife to some of the people that I call my friends, to some of the teachers that I know, that I have just the most precious people in my life.
Chris, we have to finish. I think it's a great place to finish, and I think you are a true inspiration how more can metamorphise into celebration and happiness, and I think that's such an important thing in life, and I guess it's something we're all searching for. So Thank you for coming in to Conscious TV, Chris. And please do check out Chris's website, stillnessspeaks.com. And thank you for watching Conscious TV. And I hope we see you again soon. Goodbye.